So I'm delighted to say that we're joined today by a panel of experts who are going to take us through some Q&A panel discussions on sustainability. So my name's Hallam Wheatley. I work for SABIC and I'm a Future Leaders Group member for the Foundation Industries. But before we get started and before we introduce our panel, I'm going to ask Sarah Connolly to go through what UKRI are doing with respect to the Foundation Industries. So Sarah, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Hallam. Hi, everyone. Welcome to our panel event today on sustainability in the foundation industries. My name's Sarah Connolly, and I'm the innovation lead for the Transforming Foundation Industries Challenge. So firstly, a quick welcome from UKRI, UK Research and Innovation. We are the parent organisation which brings together the 9 research councils. So I sit within Innovate UK, but we work very closely across all of the research councils, investing over £7 billion each year across academia and industry to generate knowledge with impact. Innovate UK, if you haven't heard of us before, we are the business-facing arm of UKRI, and we work to drive productivity and economic growth by supporting our businesses to develop new ideas and new technologies, also connecting them with other organisations that can help them generate value from their concepts. So the Foundation Industries Challenge was set up a couple of years ago to work across the 6 sectors that we term the foundation industries. So the ceramics, glass, cement, metals, paper and chemicals industry. Together, they're worth a huge amount to the UK economy and employ large numbers of people, mainly outside of the southeast. But there are 2 really large challenges that are approaching us on the horizon. The first is that by far they are our largest industrial polluters and generate 10% of all of the UK's CO2 emissions. But also they're competing against new plants coming up from emerging economies. And it means that retrofitting new technologies is really difficult and needs to coincide with capital investment cycles. So we've got a few challenges to come up against. But our challenge was really set up to transform the foundation industries so that they're internationally competitive in manufacturing the products that are vital to our economy, but by doing so in an environmentally sustainable way. We accelerate innovation, we support pilot scale facilities, we run collaborative R&D programs, we develop the foundation industries as a sector in its own right, help close that gap between academia and industry, and accelerate the growth of new technologies and fast-growing businesses. So in terms of what that looks like for our challenge, we are a £149 million programme, with 66 million of that coming directly from government funding, and we're running through till 2024. We are supporting the innovation that's needed to develop resource and energy efficient technologies. We sit between directly funded phase programs that kind of sit at the top of the TRL scale, more around the deployment end, and university-led research, which is really at the bottom of that technology readiness level scale. So we focus on developing new technologies and scaling them to be able to take on and be deployed. Our activities cross 3 main areas. The first one is around funding, so delivering funding programs that come through a variety of tools and mechanisms, but really looking to deliver results that outweigh the sum of its parts. So that includes the pilot scale facility that I'm sure we'll cover later, collaborative research and development, co-investing with private equity investors to support startups and SMEs who are new to the space, and an academic research programme that lasts the life of the challenge. The second area is around connecting. So these are 6 sectors that traditionally wouldn't have worked together. And so there's been a few challenges to overcome in showing where there are areas of commonality and the reason to work together, and also bringing academia and RTOs into the discussions to help solve some of these common areas. And the final area, which we see really as being the most important, is enabling us to transform the sector. So we've got a number of areas where we are taking a leadership role and facilitating cross-cutting activities, mainly around the future workforce and making sure we have the skills and diverse talent in place to underpin these industries, but also working with government to make sure the right policies and pull factors are in place, and looking internationally to see where we can learn from, where we can trade with, and ultimately where we can collaborate with to develop the technologies that we both need for a sustainable future. So our Future Leaders Group was set up just over a year ago to help our challenge team engage deeper into the foundation industry sectors that we support and provide more active feedback around the initiatives and the support programs that we've set up as a challenge. We really wanted a wide diversity of thought and backgrounds to enable us to get the right feedback for our challenge. So the group was set up to change the status quo, to transform perceptions of the foundation industries, to drive the ED&I agenda, increase the talent, the pipeline of future talent into our industries, and bring the industries closer together with a strong, cohesive sector and influential voice. Our group membership is made up of emerging influential figures from within the foundation industries who all come from a wide variety of backgrounds and bring a diverse range of current perspectives on industry priorities and enrich our collective thinking as a challenge team. It provides the group members a platform to influence our activities, to learn more about the priorities and technologies from different foundation industries, and especially around that common area of sustainability. Ultimately, the group provides a strong professional network to share and grow together, and we're looking to grow this platform. So as a quick note, we are currently recruiting new members of the group. So if you are an independent thinker who's confident in challenging activities and ready to invest in the journey of us transforming the foundation industries, and you are an early career professional, so within 10 years from your last period of study, then we'd love to hear from you, and we will flash up the details of our email address at the end. So thank you, and I will pass back to Hallam.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Sarah. Done a better job than I could have done. So thank you. I think now is the best time to introduce our panel. So we've got a great panel today who are kind of spread across the foundation industries, but I'm going to let you all introduce yourselves. So I'll just do it from how I can see it on my screen, if that's okay. So Emily, are you okay introducing yourself first?
Yeah. My name's Emily Landsborough. I am Sustainability Advisor at Ibstock Group. We make bricks and concrete for the residential housing market. We're a UK-based business, so we've got about 2,000 employees and 36 facilities across the country. My background is probably unusual for this group, so I come from a environmental campaigning background. I spent 16 years in the charity sector, working with big businesses on their sustainability and responsible business journeys and strategies, and really pushing to get business to move into a position of leadership, and joined Ibstock 2 years ago.
Brilliant. Geoff.
Thank you very much, Hallam. Good morning. It's a real pleasure to be given 2 minutes to talk about yourself. I do recommend it as an interesting, cathartic challenge. I was brought up on a small family farm in South Armagh, Northern Ireland. I actually started out as an ecologist for my first degree and followed it up with a range of interesting postgrad qualifications, including an MBA and a doctorate for fun while I was working in various things. I'm a fellow of the Institute of Directors, Royal Society for Chemistry, and the Institute of Environmental Management and Assessment. And for the last 20 years, I've been inside BASF. I'll come to who BASF is in a second. I also advise a wide range of groups inside and outside the organisation in science, environment, and further education. My work history is a little checkered, if I may. I started off after my degree going to the US to play American football. I came back and ran nightclubs and bingo halls. I then joined the Health and Safety Executive as a prosecuting inspector in the UK. I had a slight change of direction. I got involved in communications in all sorts of different ways and decided that was a professional avenue for me. And as I said, for the last 20 years, have worked within BASF. Along the way, I've spent 20 years in my summer holidays running development courses for teenagers and 15 years building schools and hospitals in Africa. BASF is 115,000 employees across the world, supporting all sectors. We're a chemicals technology business. In the UK, we're about a dozen sites and a turnover of about 2 billion. My role, well, my title is Corporate Affairs and Sustainability Director, but in real terms, I'm a director of the PLC, and I've got a service portfolio in UK and Ireland, and I am the champion of BASF's sustainability network in Europe. And I talk a lot. Thank you for the invitation to be here.
Brilliant. Thanks, Geoff. I've known you a few years, Geoff, and I'm still learning stuff about you.
Still damaged, Hallam, still damaged.
Thanks for that, Geoff. Rob.
Good morning. I hope you can hear me okay. Brilliant. So yeah, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me to be part of this panel. It's a great privilege to be here. So thank you for that. My name's Rob Ireson. I'm the Innovation and Partnerships Manager for Glass Futures. So I oversee all of the technical activities in the organisation. My background, I studied material science metallurgy at University of Cambridge. I then spent 8 years working in the research division of Tata Steel in the UK, mainly focusing on surface chemistry and coatings. And then in 2012, I then transitioned to the glass sector. So I headed up the innovation team for an organisation called British Glass. They have a technical division called Glass Technology Services. So I worked there for 10 years, got involved in a whole range of interesting, exciting technologies, developing glass materials for everything from glass bottles through to glasses that can help heal broken hips, through to glasses that can be used in lasers for a whole host of applications. So that was a great time there. And then whilst I was there, I started to get involved in working with the team there to really work out how we can support the glass industry to address some of the sustainability challenges that it's facing. One of the big challenges the industry has, as with many foundation industries, is how to take research that's done on the smaller lab scale, particularly in universities, and how we actually then get that into industry as quickly as possible. So out of those discussions, the vision of Glass Futures emerged, and I gradually got more and more sucked into it, and then joined Glass Futures full time a couple of years ago. So that's my background. Just in case for anyone who isn't familiar with Glass Futures, as I mentioned, Glass Futures is there really as a kind of platform for the global glass industry to come together to do research to address some of the big challenges, but also take advantage of some of the opportunities that the industry has at the moment. At the heart of what we're trying to do, or one of our kind of flagship projects, is the development of a 30-ton per day pilot facility, which we're currently building in St Helens at the moment, that's due to come online next year. The aim is that this provides a platform that's sort of a big enough scale to be industrially relevant, so that if we do trials on this line, we can actually translate those through to industry. Then also the facility is going to be developed so that it's sort of small enough and flexible enough to do a whole series of really ambitious tests, covering everything from sort of low carbon fuels, looking at using hydrogen or biofuels in glass making, through to sort of new raw materials, new digital technologies and the like. And then the other big remit, exciting part of being involved in Glass Futures is the fact that we get to work with other industries as well. So on quite a few of the projects that we're working on at the moment, we're working closely with the ceramic sector, with the steel sector and cement as well. So that's a very quick overview of Glass Futures.
Oh, fantastic. Thanks, Rob. Finally, Eoin.
Morning, everyone, and thank you for the opportunity to be a part of this. It's very exciting. I have to say my background is not as checkered as Geoff, but quite checkered nonetheless. and I come from the other end of Ireland. I come from the south, and grew up with a family of butchers. So I kind of have already grew up with an idea of supply chains and understanding the value of where stuff comes from. So my background, I came to the UK in 1996 to study design, a degree in product design. So my background starts off in the design area, and for about 15 years in the automotive industry, designing cars. And through that, I started to get an understanding of full life cycle and how design plays an important role in the impact of industry and the impact of industry on society and the environment. And so and about 15 years ago, I started developing into the ideas of cradle to cradle eco-design and what became known as circular economy. So I've been specializing in that and working with industries over the last few years to really embed circularity thinking into what they do and how they do it. And 3.5 years ago, I joined Celsa as the UK innovation manager. And a lot of my activity, my role there is to help the organization to understand what circularity is, to understand how they can contribute to an economy which is circular, and facilitate circular steel through the utilization of what we already have in terms of our electric arc furnace and the ability to be able to recycle 1.2 million tons of scrap in the UK every year. So Celsa is a family-run business. It's it started off in Spain in the 1960s, using electric arc furnace steelmaking as a more sustainable way of producing products, mainly for the construction sector. In the UK, we have our main site in Cardiff, and we have approximately about 2,000 employees across the UK, covering I think about 20 sites across the UK in terms of scrap processing, steelmaking in Cardiff, and downstream fabrication facilities, which brings the product directly to the construction site. Part of what we're also doing is looking to decarbonize what we currently do and our processes, and we have like many organizations have a pathway to net zero. Certainly the work we're doing with TFI and the collaboration with the other foundation industries is pivotal to helping us to achieve that. But we also feel that circularity is a way to underpin everything else, and hopefully we can truly embrace the opportunities that exist around circularity, and we can be a positive element and a positive influence on this going forward. So yeah, that's kind of a broad brush look at me and Celsa. So yeah, I look forward to the discussion.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Really appreciate it. Kind of some broad different backgrounds and different sectors. It's great. And I think it's hopefully going to lead to some really good questions and conversations. So so the way this is going to work, so the future leaders have compiled some questions for you. These are they're not sector specific, they're quite general questions, and hopefully will lead to some cross-sector answers. I'm going to ask the question, and then I'm going to ask each of you individually. If you want to interject a point, by all means use the raise your hand feature within Zoom, and we can kind of get that in. But the first question we have comes from Michael Adjuman from Metis Aerospace, and it's quite a broad question, and it's, what does sustainability mean to you? So Emily, I'm going to ask you to start, if that's okay.
That's mean. Well, I mean, for me personally, sustainability means thinking about our responsibilities in every decision we make. It's about how you can prioritize people and planet before profit. Don't often say that within my business, but that for me, that's what it's about. It's about thinking how I can have, or how we can have, a positive impact on planet and society through the work that we do.
Yeah. Geoff.
Obviously there's two lines to the question, personal and professional. From a business perspective, given what we are and what we do, part of what we do as sustainability is we provide a viable future for enhanced quality of life. And we would certainly start the conversation by talking about the responsible use of our technologies and making the best use of available resources. Building in the UN SDGs and being committed to the climate agreement is part of that conversation. Net zero commitments are built into where we are going forward. And we've been looking at our solutions and our portfolio now for about 15 years to try and decouple resource consumption from growth. And we may want to explore that as we go forward. There's also the wider conversation around everything from human rights and responsibility to the softer issues around our people and the people we work with. Personally, it's about making the right choices, and it's about understanding enough to make the right choices. And I would throw two other phrases in which may or may not need explored. One is science literacy, because you have to understand the choices you're making. And the other one is carbon literacy, because I think the problem we have in our society is people are making choices based on not completely understood information. Let's be generous. Thank you.
Rob.
Thanks. So I'd echo what Emily and Geoff have said. I think also in terms of sustainability, I'm just conscious it's such a multifaceted area. There's so many different levels to it. So just thinking about what we're trying to do within Glass Futures, there's again a whole host of aspects to sustainability. So there's obviously wanting to make sure that we, as Glass Futures, are sustainable. So how do we sort of minimise the impact of our operations and of the activities that we do, both on the environment and on society that we're working with. But then there's also how do we sort of improve the sustainability of those other people that we're working with and of industry as a whole and of society as a whole. So how can we help others adopt good practices, reduce CO2 emissions, for example, use new raw materials, increase recycling rates, but then how can we help the people we're working with to help society become more sustainable? So for example, a lot of the materials that are made within the foundation industries have an opportunity to have an impact on society. We can make construction more sustainable. We can reduce the energy that's used in buildings. The materials we make go into making wind farms and solar panels. So I think there's that big opportunity that we need to kind of also be focusing on. In terms of society, I think there's also a lot that as foundation industries we can do to influence the way society works and thinks. So one big example in the glass sector is the area of recycling. Just by changing recycling habits, we feel that we can have a massive impact in the amount of glass that can actually get back to the furnace in terms of the quality and the volumes. So I think that's a part that we have to play as foundation industries. How can we kind of challenge the way society thinks about those areas to actually maximize the impact of some of the sustainability measures that are going on there? I think it's also, when thinking about sustainability, it's important also to think of the social dynamic as well. So often we think about the environmental impact, which is obviously extremely important. But I think also as foundation industries, we kind of need to think through the skills and the people side of things as well. How do we actually make the human side of our industry sustainable? How do we make it a place that's attractive to work, that sort of the next generation of engineers wants to come into and work with? And how do we give them the skills that are needed, not just replacing the skills of people who are retiring now, like the engineering skills, but actually there's a whole load of new skills that industry are going to need, particularly in areas such as the kind of the digital technology side, but also just things like new fuels. Like the use of hydrogen in industry is just something that's not really been done. There's not that experience that will need new skill sets as well. So I think when thinking about sustainability, I think we also need to capture that element as well.
Yeah, I agree. Fine, Eoin.
That's a big question, and although there's elements of what each of the other panelists have mentioned, I agree. There's several bits I don't agree on. For me, well, I'm fortunate that I'm working for an organisation my personal and professional opinions are kind of starting to marry together. So which is quite refreshing, and And it's been a long time since I've ever been able to say that. For me, sustainability is it's a bit of a benign word, to be perfectly honest, and it doesn't really say very much in terms of where we can go to. It talks more about just quantifying the impact of what we have now as a society, as a species. For me, sustainability is circularity. We can't have a future which is sustainable and prosperous without it being circular. Because if we're decarbonizing a linear system, it's still a broken linear system, and therefore when we start talking about I suppose planet and people over profit, sorry, Emily, just to your point, I think it needs to be profitable, because if it's not profitable for a business to do something, then they wouldn't do it, and they shouldn't do it, and it should. But the happy coincidence of being circular or delivering circularity means that you eliminate your environmental impact and you start to build more equality into society, and you're profitable because you're not wasting anything, and you're not having to pay the cost of being a polluter or being anything else. So I think it's a very broad topic, and it can cover many different areas, and including skills development and knowledge transfer. But at this stage, we still don't know enough. As a species, as industries, we don't know enough about what we can do, what we should do. If we and just one point that Geoff made around carbon, I think if we decarbonize what we currently have, we end up with a lot of electric vehicles and wind turbines. But if we don't consider the full life cycle of those electric vehicles and wind turbines, we're creating a bigger mess for the future that we've yet to realize. So I think sustainability needs to be about understanding the entire system, understanding the full life cycle of everything we do, and the full impact of those decisions we make. So yeah, I could talk all day, and I see already there's a couple of hands up, so I can hear a debate coming along.
No, that's why we're here. Emily, your hand was up first.
Thanks. I don't know if it's debate. I think it's probably more agreeing. And I think, my personal view, I didn't put across the kind of business view, and I completely agree. You have to have profit to make it function. I think we can move to a world where profit comes as a result of those good behaviours, and that's, I think, where my personal and professional careers align. I think for Ibstock and for our sector, that circularity piece is really, really crucial, and we're not mature in it yet. We haven't kind of got that thinking, and I think for lots of us, the products that we make last such a long time that it hasn't been something that we've necessarily had to think about previously. And I think there's a really big and exciting challenge to looking at the world differently. And I'd be really interested to sort of understand how you're doing that at Celsa, and how we can build on that. I think for us at Ibstock, we talk about how we address climate change, how we improve lives, and how we manufacture materials that will last for a lifetime, or manufacture materials for life. And that's really, having those three areas of focus has really helped us to kind of integrate sustainability into what we do. That's not necessarily easy, but I think starting to get people focusing on what the big challenges are and what their understanding of that, building their understanding of that, and then getting action from that is the way that we're thinking about sustainability.
Thanks, Emily. Geoff, your hand's up.
Yeah, I think on the grounds that this is very much a discussion rather than anything else, and as has already been said quite openly, the conversation immediately does this, because it just goes wide. It's enormous. I think one thing we should all agree on to start with, going back to the comment already made, we can't continue like this. That's a straight, flat statement. We can't continue down this road. From our perspective and from my perspective, it is about thinking about systems, about models, about circularity, but it's also thinking about things like, how do things work? Why do we have them? And helping people with their choices. Because somehow along the line, we have to educate people that they can't recycle 3 or 4 bits and pieces out of their back door and then get on a plane to go on holiday. And they have to understand the way that works. And we also can't just blame the consumer, because I hate to be honest, we have to take responsibility for our actions. We have to take leadership to provide better choices for people and possibly to filter those choices. Now, that may not be a very democratic conversation, but we have to ensure that when we're talking about things like decarbonisation, somewhere along the line, we have to start making those decisions to push the markets in the right direction.
Brilliant. Thanks, Geoff. And I think that leads quite nicely onto our next question. And this is from Lucy Smith of the Materials Processing Institute. What's the biggest barrier for you as a sector, as a company, as an industry, to being more sustainable? I'm going to start with you, Rob.
I think it's already been highlighted already. It's probably the economic barriers. So I think Eoin made a really good point there. If it's not economically viable and economically sustainable, then it's not going to be viable long term. So I think certainly within the glass sector, it always comes down to economics. There's certainly the heart is there, the desire is there across, I think, all of the foundation industries. But it's sort of how do you marry that up and make it affordable, both at the kind of research level. So the amount of research that needs to be done and the scale that it needs to be done at it's going to be costly. So I think initiatives like the UKRI Transforming Foundation Industries scheme have been absolutely fantastic in terms of sort of getting issues to the forefront, getting the industries to work together and catalysing some of that early stage research. And hopefully that can continue. But then it's also then sort of how do you actually get these technologies into industry? I think the challenge is that often, and I think it will be the case, is that the technologies that will improve sustainability will be more expensive to run. I think that's almost kind of given, certainly in the kind of short term. So it's like, how do we then marry that up and kind of share the costs across the supply chain, for example? So I think a success story we've observed in the glass sector is that the end users, particularly some of the big brands like Diageo and Heineken, are starting to get more involved in thinking through how they can help their supply chain become more sustainable, and how that kind of the benefits and the value of sustainability can be shared throughout the supply chain and to the end user. But I guess, going back to the question, I think the biggest barrier is probably going to be that economic one.
So I might kind of reword the question then. So it's kind of what is the biggest support that you feel you need as a sector, whether that's from government or whatnot, to become more sustainable? Is it help with that economic side of it? Is it government support, or I don't know. That I'll mix that in with the question as well. I don't know if that changes the question slightly, Rob.
Biggest, but I mean, the trouble is the answer is always kind of more money, more grants. But I think it's kind of more than that. So I think there is certainly a big element at the kind of the policy level, but also the kind of national sort of psyche level almost. How can we sort of communicate the messages like the one that was flagged up? It's, you can't just kind of recycle a few tins and a few glass bottles and then get on a plane. And then that message is coming out, but I think at some level the government needs to think through how it can engage with society to communicate those. So I'd say, there's the financial element. There's going to need to be a lot of kind of financial support, but then also there's going to be need for support at the kind of policy level. How can we kind of sort of change the way things are done, the regulations for industry to kind of incentivize and lower the kind of hurdles that have to be overcome to implement some of these sustainable technologies? And then what can the government do to sort of really make sure that there's those kind of aligned messages that are given to the general public?
Yeah, perfect. Emily, I saw your hand go up and then go down. I don't know. I'll come to you next anyway.
Okay. I think for us, I think it's I completely agree. The economics and the investment is huge barrier. I think it's about culture and also about how we can lead our customers. because how and the sort of risks that we take in terms of how far we push rather than be led by customers and those sorts of dynamics, because the house building sector is relatively traditional, and the kind of move that we're going to need homeowners to make to move to a more sustainable future is significant, and how much as a materials manufacturer within that big system you can push and lead, and how much you invest in that is quite a difficult sort of calculation to make, I think. I think for us, the cultural change from a fairly traditional industry, where we're a sort of collection, probably over time, of family-run businesses that have kind of all come together. I think the culture change to moving to being a PLC and to taking sustainability kind of into the heart of what we do is a huge challenge. I think we're lucky at Ibstock. We have an enlightened leadership team. They get sustainability and they want to drive that through. So I think that puts us in a good position already. But I think connecting that up, I mean, actually, we also have hugely passionate people about sustainability, but how you make that connection between someone's passion and their beliefs and then their actual action in a business, there's often a disconnect there. And some of that is understanding and knowledge and building that, exactly as Geoff says, that kind of literacy around the decisions you can make and their ultimate impacts. But also some of that is about kind of permission and culture change in a business to get those impacts to run right the way through. So I think there's, for us, the economics, absolutely, culture and leadership. I think it's not really, well, it is a barrier. It's something that needs to change. And then, what was my other point?
Yeah,
sure, I made it.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I work for a big organization. It's sustainability is changing the whole business model. And that's a big thing that we've seen challenges. But Eoin, what are your thoughts?
That question in itself, what are my thoughts, is a dangerous one to ask. And what I've realized is that you can ask me the simplest question, I can make as a very deep philosophical answer for a long period of time. I could say things like similar to Rob in terms of funding and financing, resources, skills, knowledge. All those things are all barriers to moving just business forward, let alone sustainability forward. But I think the biggest barrier we probably all have is it kind of tips on what Emily has said around culture, but actually the culture we have as a society, our addiction to a linear approach, our addiction to profit, an addiction to selling more and more stuff is the biggest barrier we have, because we're so used to doing this for such a long time. We've been, I suppose, educated and transformed into this machine to be digging more and more stuff up and selling more and more stuff, because that's the only way we can actually make any profit, and that's how we quantify prosperity is by selling more and more stuff. And because we sell more stuff, we just concentrate on the point of sale. We don't care what happens before or after. And that's the biggest barrier to any sort of sustainable approach going forward, is the fact that everything we do as a society, particularly in the West, is dedicated to that point of sale. And if we can somehow start educating more and educating everybody about the opportunities that exist around looking at the system and about the value that exists in that system, that goes beyond the point of sale, then we're in a much better position to move this whole agenda forward and to deliver solutions that are viable for a prosperous future.
Interested in sorry to interrupt, what you see kind of our role as manufacturers in leading that, because that's the bit I was trying to sort of get at with the homeowner. So, the homeowner is removed from us. There's lots of intermediaries in between our products and how we sell them, and then the homeowner. So how we influence that is really interesting to me. I just thought,
that's a good question, and I'm glad you asked, because we are here on this discussion about foundation industries, and foundation industries, I think, as they have been for a linear economy, are equally as important for a circular economy, because we can again build a foundation for circularity going forward. What we need to be doing is starting to engage and integrate and collaborate with the supply chains above us. We like Celsa is a low tier commodity supplier and always has been, but we're now starting to influence the developers, the property developers, the architects, the engineers who are specifying what goes into the design of a building, and they're coming to us to say what can we do to support them, or what, and we're in the process now of actually guiding them through what they can do. The bit in the middle is the subcontractors, the contractors, the subcontractors. They're now being specified by those developers as to what is needed, and again, it's being able to at least understand how resources can be utilized more effectively, and then delivering those solutions back into a supply chain is key to making this happen. And I think it's not one size fits all. It's going to be we're going to have to look to be adaptable to change, but look at resources that are all around us, though. Like, for example, construction industry. The fact that we still demolish buildings is phenomenally inefficient and stupid, in my opinion. We can design for disassembly. We can disassemble. We can reuse. We can remanufacture. We can reprocess eventually. But ultimately, if we're a foundation industry, we as foundation industries can provide those resources as a service into those applications, then that's when we can have real benefit, because ultimately it's our resource, it's our materials that we can provide in, and we can do it from a glass perspective, from a ceramics perspective, the steel perspective, even a chemical perspective, because you can actually lease molecules, and those molecules are a part of a whole service system. That's if you understand how they can apply, then I think foundation industries are, in my opinion, key to making this happen. Hopefully that answers your question.
It does. Thanks, Eoin. And finally, Geoff.
Word finally in this conversation is quite an interesting starting point. I think the reality, and we're actually agreeing quite vehemently across the piece, because actually part of the conversation, and let me go right back to your question, what barriers are there? Number one, strategy and understanding. The other conversation regarding the chemical industry is energy, because the answer is you need to decarbonize energy and you need to decarbonize the raw material right up the top end of the value chain. Because actually, if we can start producing the molecules at zero carbon, as those cascade down the value chain, it becomes a really interesting part of the dialogue. Now, given that is said, I can also throw in things like business models, which we've touched on, and services, which is absolutely key to this conversation. The other question in there is, how do we measure value? I'm afraid I've been uppity for an awfully long time about greenwash. And you can find me wandering around professional events being rude to standholders all over Europe because of what's written on posters and things, and it really winds me up. I go and pick arguments just for my own entertainment because it infuriates me how people measure value. And let me throw in a couple of things. Diageo was mentioned. We've been working with Diageo on a completely recyclable bottle for whiskey, and that's on the market right now. And funny enough, it works beautifully. And the answer is, it's a lot more sustainable than glass. That is a systems change, but we can talk about how that works. The other thing, because I'm old and grey, I hate to say it, I'm sorry, I have clothes older than some of the people on this call. And that's another part of the conversation. It's about building in that life cycle conversation. And it's about making those choices. And for the people watching this, can I just say to you, things do come back into fashion unbelievably. So you can actually make those choices. And when we're talking about construction, I agree completely that just knocking stuff down and rebuilding it without thought and strategy is an appalling waste of everything. But somewhere along the line, we have to deal with things like fashion and consumption. And that comes back to systems and services. And again, I use the word leadership. We have to start by leading and giving people better decisions to make. And going right back to my starting point when I mentioned energy, I work in the chemical industry. If I had used the word sustainability 10 years ago in our company, a proportion of people wouldn't have fully understood, but they would have understood the fact that they shouldn't be using energy, because that's a cost. And part of this conversation is that sustainability is good business. Across the piece, sustainability is good business. And we have to also put that in. And as a last comment, and I see your hand up, Emily, so I will shut up eventually. The last comment I would make is we're trying to take a global view of our business because we're a global business. But then you get all sorts of little black swans that appear. So, for example, let me throw in the plastics tax in the UK, which makes no differentiation between the different polymers. And what's currently coming into the legislation is likely to be driving sustainability the wrong way. And we've made representation to HMRC, we've made representation to all sorts of people, and the answer is it's too difficult for them to understand. And I'm quite happy to be rude to the policymakers, because what they're not doing is listening to the people who actually know about the decisions. And that part is education again, because somewhere along the line we have to agree a lexicon for this dialogue. And it's certainly not there yet.
Emily.
Well, I just thought, while Geoff was talking of another barrier that I think we haven't mentioned, and that is data availability. I think it feeds into this whole life cycle approach, which we can't understand until we have the proper data. And that's certainly something that we're seeing in our industry, is really increasing the amount of information that we need to be providing, and that we need to be understanding ourselves so that we can provide the right information to our customers.
Oh, and I think your hand was up first.
Yeah, just data. It's another pet peeve of mine, and I think Emily's right. We need to we need to have the data, but actually we have lots of data already. We have data coming out of our ears. We don't use it. We don't utilize it effectively. What do we do? What does government do with all the data they have? What is the Environment Agency or NRW in Wales doing with the data they already have? Very little. Because they will claim GDPR is the issue or the reason why they're not using that data. Like, for example, the automotive industry. And I spent many years designing products in the automotive industry, and for as long as the end-of-life vehicle directive, and don't get me started on policy, but the end-of-life vehicle directive has been around a long time, and part of that is for tier suppliers to submit their bill of materials onto a database. So that there is an inventory of all the materials driving around in vehicles for the last 25 years, and we do nothing with it. So we know exactly what materials are in the car. We know exactly what plastics are in a car. We know exactly what steel and what electronics and all the different components and critical resources that are driving around in vehicles, but we do nothing with it. So we therefore then do not utilize that to be able to find out where the value is in those cars. And then the policy allows manufacturers to put up with scrapping cars by crushing them and shredding them, and ultimately the only valuable thing you can do with that material is actually put into rebar, which we utilize. So data, yeah, we have lots of data, we just don't utilize it. We need to understand how we can use the data we already have, the same way as we need to understand the resources we already have and understand the value in there. So data for me is just another resource that we waste.
Yeah. Rob.
I guess first of all, I had to respond to Geoff's dig at glass and being not a sustainable material. And I'll take the line of the industry. I mean, but I think you kind of highlight an interesting thing there, just in terms of kind of perceptions. So I think often some people might perceive glass not to be very sustainable because you need high temperatures to melt it. But actually, if you kind of delve in to how glass is actually made and some of the technologies that the industry is working on and some of the kind of reusable technologies, actually one of the routes we're exploring at the moment could well lead to a net carbon negative manufacturing route to making glass. And I think kind of society kind of needs to kind of hear that and understand it. And I'm like plastic, and I'll probably get shot by some of our members if I say this, but plastic does have a valuable role to play, as does glass. So I think at one level it is trying to work out what's the best material or best combinations of materials actually that deliver the most sustainable solutions. But I think going back to the question in terms of what are the barriers, and I think people have touched on it, but I thought I'd kind of pick it out explicitly. I do think those kind of supply chains and trying to get those supply chains aligned is a barrier in lots of sectors, in fact probably every sector. So again, I think one of the challenges that we really need to kind of think through how to focus on how to engage, maybe as foundation industries together, is how can we really start to align those supply chains, particularly with that kind of digital element. I think there's a big opportunity there to work out how we kind of trace materials and sort of put kind of information on there so people can actually kind of track the history, where it's come from, what the environmental footprint is, what the value of that is. But then also, I think Emily mentioned kind of how do you engage with the architects? You're engaging with the architects. Celsa is, glass futures and the glass industry are as well. I'm just wondering, are we all trying to kind of go separately? And if we all kind of aligned our efforts in terms of working together to think, how can we make a truly sustainable building? How do we influence the architects, make them aware of the opportunities, show them how with maybe a little bit of pooled funding in the right places across the foundation industries, they may well end up with carbon negative building materials, for example. So yeah, I think that supply chain piece is a barrier, but also a massive opportunity.
Yeah. Owen, I don't know if that's your hand up or is it still, yeah.
Yeah, that's sorry. It just I think there's a few things there. I thought of one thing that Rob was saying, and then there was a few more things that came along. I think one of the in terms of barriers, and I think each barrier, I know it's a very kind of a very management speak, that any barrier, any challenge can be made into an opportunity. So, but I think it's true. I think whatever. And I learned this very, very quickly. I worked as a consultant for a little while, supporting government on government industry support schemes. And the first thing I went in thinking I could tell people what they need to do, which is a really silly mistake to make. But I learned very quickly, and that actually the first thing to do is listen to what those challenges are, and without having to talk about sustainability or circularity or eco design, I was able to just feed some little bits, snippets of information to the person who had this big issue, and they were able to come back with a solution that could be said to be circular or sustainable or whatever. But it's about listening. And I think the other thing with supply chains is about actually having a conversation with supply chains. Don't just assume that that's because they're not giving you the information or you're not asking for the information that it's not actually happening. Or they're not interested in the solution. Just go and have a conversation. Spend some time with the entire supply chain. I think that's something useful that's foundation industries can do. The other thing is we mustn't assume that to be innovative we need to be technology. We need to be advancing technology. One of the biggest things for me, actually, on several occasions, the biggest catalyst for change has been just the subtlest little thing. And we did a pilot project with BAM Construction, and really to explore the idea of closed loop steel and circular steel and see if it was actually possible. And I had a conversation over coffee with one of the sustainability advisors for BAM. And there was a demolition project taking place fairly close to Cardiff. And I asked, was any scrap material coming from that? And they said yes. And all it needed to do to kick it into gear was that the Celsa's name had to be on the waste transfer note from the demolition site. That was it. And that's the tiniest little subtlety that was able to kick circularity and the conversation on circularity into play. That didn't need any technology or any sort of process change or even any sort of education. But these little things can happen without having to spend lots of money.
Yeah. Geoff, I see your hands up, but I'm going to ask the next question if that's okay, because I think it rolls nicely into what you're all kind of discussing anyway, and I'm hoping this will add an extra kind of dimension. So this question's from Kira Sudrant-Campbell from the University of Sheffield, and it touches on something that you mentioned, Geoff, about energy and being big consumers of energy, but also I think it kind of nicely rolls into the supply chain question. And it talks about a tremendous amount of focus is put on sustainability of the power and energy sectors. Of course, the foundation industries and the manufacturing sector are massive users of energy and therefore have the power to influence just how sustainable the energy that you're getting is. And the question is it something that you can imagine, your own industry starting to consider or even insist is that, the energy that we're using becomes more sustainable? But then that question kind of rolls nicely into the supply chain comments that you've made, Owen. Do you have the power? Do you envisage a situation where you kind of insist on the whole supply chain being more sustainable? Geoff, I'll let you answer that one first.
Thank you, Hallam. The starting point in the energy piece is a simple one. From our side of things as a commercial business, it's up to us what we do. Therefore, our two biggest investments globally in the last 3 years has been in green energy. Multi-billion euro investments in renewable energy. And that's our way of starting to get the conversation to where we want it to be. It will take time. It's certainly not going to happen in 2 years. The reality of where we're at with the energy conversation is you have to know where your hotspots are. You need to know where to balance and deal with them. And I'm sorry, Hallam, going back to the previous question, the conversation about energy, and let's take the glass versus plastic conversation. For me, it's not a dialogue. If someone can simply sit in front of me and say, these are the metrics, that's all I want to hear. I want to see science-based decision making. I want to see clear metrics for what people are talking about. The other part of that conversation, taking on the question of simple things we can do, it's all about understanding that we may once have known the answer and we've simply changed our view. I know it's an awfully old-fashioned conversation to have, the use of washing lines rather than tumble dryers, insulating our homes. How are we still in 2022 talking about insulating our homes? It's come back allegedly back on the political agenda now because of the price of energy, but we should have insulated our homes a generation ago. This is ridiculous. And the last glib conversation I would make about energy is that when we're talking about the materials and the basis of industry, it's still about choices. We touched on bottles, for example. I would also say that, don't forget, in our industry, alcohol is a solution. And also part of that conversation is alcohol is not a requirement for human life. And that's a really difficult conversation in some places. And we can have that one as well.
Rob.
Yeah, the energy one's a tricky one because I think there's different levels. So I mean, I think every company, if they were given free green energy, would kind of bite your hand off. And I think the first challenge to overcome is developing the technologies that can use the green energy that's available. So I think there's a need to kind of invest in that research to kind of prove the technologies, to demonstrate them, to de-risk them, particularly things like hydrogen, but even electric. We're kind of realizing it's not necessarily straightforward to switch everything from natural gas to electric, particularly where you've got assets at manufacturers that last sort of 20, 30, 40 years. And I think, yes, there's that kind of development of the understanding. And there's also sort of looking at what that energy mix looks like. So we've done quite a bit of work sort of trying to understand how we might switch the UK glass industry to low carbon fuels. And what we're finding is that the answer will be different in different areas. So again, when thinking about sort of costs and sort of do people want to switch to green energy, how can we incentivize that? Again, it's going to be kind of region specific. So for example, in the Northwest, if the HyNet takes off, the HyNet project takes off, which will look to distribute hydrogen to that region sort of within the next sort of 10, 15 years, then hydrogen could well be the solution to manufacturing that area. Then if you look in some of the more remote parts of the UK, it's still going to be difficult to get hydrogen. And if you have to have an electrolyzer to generate your hydrogen that runs off electricity, then actually for glass making, electric melting is far more efficient than melting with a flame. So why use the electricity to generate hydrogen and to fire a process that's less efficient than just using the electricity straight off? So again, it's the balance. How do you get those fuels to the areas? I mean, even with electric melting, it's kind of the kind of solution of choice for the industry, but it can sometimes cost tens of millions of pounds to upgrade the local electricity infrastructure to get the electricity to site. So I think industry wants it, but I think there's a number of challenges we have to think about, both in terms of proving the technology, maybe developing new sort of technologies at scale that can use those green energy pieces, then also looking at the kind of availability and the economic side as well.
Eoin.
The couple of things really in terms of energy generally. Obviously, we run an electric arc furnace which uses a lot of electricity. In fact, I think it's about a quarter of, or even a third of Cardiff's electricity is used by Celsa. on an ongoing basis. And the cost of electricity at the moment is destroying us, killing us. We've had to shut down production because of it, because it's not profitable to produce steel. The UK energy mix, the UK national grid and the network is we're switching off all the coal-fired power plants, and I don't think the network's robust enough to run industry as it stands. So that we obviously need to do something along those lines with that. I think it was James Lovelock, which was probably the original Earth scientist and the guy who discovered the ozone layer. He's an advocate of nuclear, and he, to the point at which he was happy to put nuclear waste in his back garden to run it to heat his home. And I don't understand why there's such a negative. If we want to decarbonize our current system, we need to look at nuclear as one of the few viable options we have. At the moment, at least. If we want to shift to decarbonizing a circular system, we may have a lot more options for us. But ultimately, we're not going to decarbonize the current system with what we have. So there's massive debates to have around that. Just a point Geoff made around science-based targets. I absolutely agree with science-based targets, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't question the science on an ongoing basis. The current greenhouse gas emission protocol is not fit for purpose, in my opinion. It's set up to quantify a linear process, to look at scope one and two from an operational perspective is fine, but scope 3 is this kind of bizarre, benign kind of no man's land that nobody really understands what they can do with, or understand how they can bring it all together. The only way you can do that is bring it in together as a circular approach. The trouble with that, with the system on the circular, there's nothing to reward in the current system. There's nothing to reward people who are delivering circular economy, because it doesn't fit into the current system, the current protocols. So I think that needs to be addressed, and we can start to then look at how the science-based targets can facilitate circularity. And that will again help to decarbonize the overall system and to look at more efficiency, both from an energy and a resource point of view.
Yeah.
So look, again, these can be made into very, very big questions. But,
yep.
But but I think the government, going back into policy as well. Policy is a bit like the greenhouse gas emission protocol. It's not fit for purpose for a future which is supposed to be sustainable and prosperous. It's just kind of lagging behind and relying on trying to solve the problems with the same mindset that created the problems in the first place.
Yeah.
Sorry, not really answer the question. But.
No, you did. No, it's great. Emily.
Yeah, I think probably just reflect Rob's comments. I think we're in a very sort of similar situation where the will is there. It's just how fast and how far you can go with the sort of limitations of your portfolio of estates and things like that. So I think we're probably, I mean, the question was around, can we kind of collaborate to demand different supply? And I think, I don't know the answer to that. I mean, I think it's probably worth having a good discussion on, and some people getting together and thinking about it. But I think we're all looking at different ways to get there, and we all know where we want to get to. But I think the question is how quickly you can do that.
Yeah. Thank you. Geoff, hands up.
Yeah, I was going to simply bring in that when we're talking about the energy piece as a panel, I think there's a question again about education, but also somewhere here, taking the point that Emily's just made, we've also got what we can do as consumers. There's been a couple of comments about cost, and the honest answer is I don't agree that the more sustainable option will be more expensive, at least certainly not in the longer term. There might be an initial cost to get over, but we can move markets as consumers, and we can move markets as procurers of products and services within our businesses. And that comes down to strategic intent. And again, I would argue certainly that there is plenty of room for us all to do more and make better choices. And we have to call out the bad choices that are being made across the piece. And I'm sorry if that's a little contentious, but I think it needs to be said quite openly. If people make choices that are obviously not sustainable for all sorts of reasons, then that needs to be called out.
So going to your education point then, Geoff, the next question is from Stephanie Palmer of Wienerberger UK. And she mentions that sustainability of industry in the UK is about more than simply the greening of technology. It's about the people who'll support it. In the past, manufacturing jobs were an important source of employment and careers, especially in the north of the country. Today, the allure of manufacturing jobs isn't there. Do you have a sense of why there's a cultural shift in communities for manufacturing jobs, why people don't seem to be interested anymore? I'll start with you, Emily. Oh, you're on mute, Emily. Sorry.
Sorry.
Okay.
I think, well, I think there is a perception, certainly for our sector as manufacturing in the construction sector, there is a perception of that being a dirty industry where you're sort of part of that kind of standing on site and building kind of process. So I think there is a perception barrier. I also think that we're not attracting the right people. So for us at Ibstock, promoting roles to women is a huge priority for us. And there is a huge talent pool there that we aren't accessing. And that's partly because we're male dominated already. So when people come to the business, that's the environment that they're in. But also because at school, girls are much less likely to take physics or science subjects to a higher level, so through to A levels, than boys are. And so, I mean, we're certainly looking at our whole early careers programme as part of our kind of improving lives piece around how we start very, very young. So how we get our people to go into primary schools, because that is the point where decisions are made. We're also having conversations around small projects that we're doing, but looking at how you engage families, because actually if your family has experience in the construction sector, you're much more likely to choose that as a career. So there's so many different influences to how people make decisions on their careers and on their choices of GCSE and then A level or whatever they do, whichever route they take, that I think businesses have a role in engaging in all those levels. So certainly we've moved from having a very successful apprenticeship program, small but very, very successful and very focused on the kind of critical skills that we need. We're broadening that now so that we are able to bring people into different roles and expose people to the range of different roles that we require in our industry, to bring more diversity in and to make it a more sort of attractive prospect to people. So I mean, it is hugely challenging. We've just announced a target at Ibstock that we're going to move to 40% of our senior leadership team will be women by 2027, which is a massive challenge. So I think having the commitment from the top, but also having employees that we have engaged very passionately around diversity and inclusion, I think we'll start to see the dial shift on some of that skills attraction work.
Geoff.
I think the problem we're having this morning, Hallam, in this dialogue is there is no such thing as a simple answer to anything.
No.
Let me take 2 or 3 points and build on some of what Emily's just said as well. Manufacturing roles, what does that mean, is a first question, because actually when we're talking about things like system solutions and what people will choose to do and what people will not choose to do, there's a whole conversation, and I get the point of the question that was asked about greening industry. It is about far more than that. It's about the future of industry per se. The D&I piece, frankly, has not been grasped by big chunks of industry. And the question of inclusion, the question of looking and reflecting the societies in which we operate in, frankly, again, I'm sorry, needs to be called out. The other thing for me is about role models in some of this area. Emily's talked about the fact that it's all about getting into the families at a certain age, but also there's a question about role models. if you take some of the industries we work in, and I'll not bore you completely, we've got a couple of dozen drone pilots that work in our businesses. They work in our agriculture business. They are licensed drone pilots. Now, the answer is, put those up out there for the average 9-year-old, and you get a very interesting conversation about what do you do for a living. Now, the fact that those drone pilots are also agronomists, they're crop doctors out in the fields, is a really interesting conversation because people don't think about industry. Somewhere in here, we have to talk about the future of work. And I use that as regards the, if we'd done this conference on a normal day, we would have an audience and we'd be sitting on a panel. The reality is, here we are. The world has changed in the last couple of years. And I also am duty bound to throw in the words levelling up in the UK, because I've no idea what they mean. And I'm quite happy to pick that row with anybody else who'd like to throw it at me, given where some of my sites are. The last point I would make about education, and I have to be very honest and declare an interest, because I'm also a trustee of an organisation called the Association for Science Education. And we have 7,500 teacher members in the UK. And for me, it's all about aiming at particularly the 7 to 12-year-olds, so you can better educate them and their households to make better choices when they go on to secondary school. And from my side of things, for example, and I say this to everyone, do you have site open days? Do you have business open days? Do you have bring your kids to work days? Do you have people going out into schools doing my job is? Because most people, parents, kids, whoever, actually, we don't know what everything looks like. You know, if you look at all of our job titles and then say, what do we do for a living? You get a whole different conversation. So I come back to education and role models and being open.
Yeah. Just adding to that as well, obviously most teachers in education, they don't leave education. So when they're expected to teach people about our jobs, they don't have that experience. But yeah, that's just my 2 pence. Eoin.
Sorry, the dogs are right. Go to Rob. Hopefully, I'll be able to.
Yeah, Rob.
Thanks. Yeah, so Emily, Geoff makes some great points there. We need to start targeting the next generation at that kind of school age. That's certainly something within Class Futures we're looking to kind of exploit and develop and encourage the industry to do. And that kind of trying to sell the industry in terms of the diverse range of different jobs and skills needed. Again, I totally agree with that. That is something which I think the message needs to get out there. Sort of, to get a job in heavy manufacturing, it doesn't involve just sitting next to a machine in oily rags all day. There's a huge range of different skills and opportunities there that I just don't think a lot of school leavers realise. So I think there's a lot we could do there. I think the other way, I suppose something I would add to that is just in the terms of the ways we communicate those opportunities, I think is critical as well. Sort of probably historically, people kind of go into schools and kind of give presentations, and I think there's still very much a need for that. But I think there are other opportunities, and also the way we kind of present things. So one of the sort of ideas we're exploring within Glass Futures and the glass industry is, can we use sort of technologies such as virtual reality and augmented reality to just kind of help young people kind of see kind of what is it like in a factory? What does learning to use a machine entail? So that's something we're looking at. Can we kind of do virtual tours, physical tours as well? How do we kind of combine the two to kind of give them a really good understanding of how exciting it is to work in manufacturing environments and sort of what it means for their career as well. And I think also then, I think there's an element in terms of trying to understand the value of these jobs. So traditionally, a lot of the jobs, well, certainly there's been a perception that they've not really had the salaries to go with the jobs compared to maybe some of the more sort of exciting industries like automotive or the finance sector. So I think as an industry also, we maybe need to think through sort of how we place a value on these jobs, particularly if these jobs are absolutely critical to making our society more sustainable. How do we put a value on that and incentivize people with that? And then how do we communicate that and make sure that people who are doing jobs that maybe might not be bringing in huge amounts of money, but if their contribution is really valuable, we need to kind of acknowledge that and reward and recognise that contribution.
It's quieter now.
Yeah, perfect.
I think touching on something Geoff had said about businesses can do more to educate and engage with schools, engage with communities and societies anyway, and to build up that kind of that piece where it's not about just as Rob said, rolling around or running around in all your rags. And at Celsa, we're trying to address that. We already do quite a bit. We're trying to do a lot more, and it's certain. There's no end goal for that for us. It's all about kind of continually developing. I think again, some of the issues we have already is a matter of down to culture, down to the fact that we've lost sight. People generally don't know where stuff comes from. Like you ask most kids where does food come from, and say, well, from the boot of Mammy's car or the shelves at Tesco's. I suppose I was fortunate that I grew up in an environment where we had a shop that prepared food, and we knew where that food came from, and my 10th birthday, my grandfather bought me a cow. So that's how diverse I was, but I had an idea where food came from that point onwards. But I don't think that's commonplace. It's certainly not. It's not from when I speak to people, and most people have no idea where stuff comes from. And I think we need to, as industries, and particularly as foundation industries, I think we have an obligation to help and educate people on where the stuff come, where the chemicals come from for the plastic bottle that we're drinking out of, and ultimately what happens to it and where it goes after that. All of that, it's all part of what we can do. The other thing I think we've again gone back to the culture. We've been since the first industrial revolution, and the fact that education was set up more or less in the West to provide people and to provide workers into that industrial revolution. We're still very much focused on the silos, and we teach subjects in school or modules in school, and you can specialize in one. But I think we could do a lot more understanding how the whole system works and how society works with those systems before you start specializing in an area, to be able to understand how ultimately you can contribute to society in a more productive way. I think the other issue we've got currently is that schools became businesses, and particularly colleges, and they became businesses, and the principals and those heads of those businesses were more interested in bums on seats as opposed to the quality teaching. And we have an issue. We can't get the right apprentices coming through because ultimately the teaching staff isn't set up to deliver the right sort of quality of apprentices coming through. We can have as many hairdressers in our business if we want, but we can't get engineers. We can't get mechanical, electrical engineers. So I think there is a balance needs to be readdressed in terms of the quality, and obviously the work Geoff is doing is trying to address that, but it's not happening across the piece. And also then from a kind of a research perspective, and again, I know those researchers listening from academia, there is still a massive disconnect between the TRL levels are not widely understood, and there's still a massive disconnect between research and development at universities and actually industries and the speed and pace in which they work. So I think there's a lot to be said for that as well. Again, another subject I could talk all day about, but I'll leave it there.
Thanks, Eoin. Geoff, your hand went up first.
Yeah, and I've just added to the list 2 or 3 more things. Thank you very much. Let's do a couple of things. Number one, cultural differences. I was never given a cow, but I had a calf, so we can have that conversation. It just depends where you've been brought up, really. I think the point about education is a good one because the Victorians have a lot to answer for in our society. The reality of the situation is this idea of silos and splitting everything apart, when actually everything is completely integrated and interlinked, everything from value chains to supply chains to frankly everything we do, is a really interesting part of the dialogue. I've already touched on the idea of role models, open days, letting people in, but part of it still comes back. even to us, none of us know it all. I mean, when we talk about the chemical industry or making things for the foundation industries, when was the last time any of us went on a visit with our eyes open and our mouth closed? And that's a conversation I'm very happy to have again with policymakers and politicians, because they need to get out more. They need to talk to real people and visit things. Talk to people working, talk to people not working, and listen to things. Regarding materials, there's a really interesting one, because if I put a bottle of shampoo in front of you, I can put 2 bottles of shampoo, molecularly identical, and one starts with trees and one starts with fossil fuels. And that's a whole different conversation for our society. And I again would throw in terminology like chem cycling, because for us, we can actually take stuff back to the molecule and put it back through a circularity. And I really will not allow this conversation to go away from we can do better than where we're at, because we really can. The question of education, and this is my additional piece, education, skills, competencies. I mean, I'm awfully sorry to sound old and grey. When I went to school, there were no computers. Tell me how we're going to be in another 30 years, because this is the problem of education. We're teaching for today, not for the society of tomorrow. And there's a whole conversation regarding skills, competencies. In the UK, the conversation around T levels is a real conversation at the moment. And I think that hasn't been looked at. And we've got to get the politicians and governments, and I do mean several, to stop flip-flopping on policy. We have to let things settle down, and let's have a look at stuff before we change it. And there was also a mention of TRL levels right at the end, and I'm just going to leave that one, because even starting that conversation and getting from a startup and a scale up through to something that really puts jobs and value in is a huge different conversation that perhaps Rob would like to take a swipe at before I go thundering in as a multinational investor.
Emily, I saw your hand was up. I don't know if no. Right. So we've probably got time for 1 or 2 more questions. I'm just conscious of all of your time. So the next one is from Imogen Harding from Ibstock. And again, this is quite a tough question for you all, so be prepared. So the sustainability of communities in the UK which resolve around manufacturing is at risk if plants leave and jobs dry up. Is the motivation enough to push for sustainability, and will this provide an economic recovery to certain deprived areas? Rob, I'm going to start with you.
I think yes. So I'll give the case study. So one of the things I've really found fascinating about the way kind of Glass Futures has evolved is, we've been on sort of almost a sort of 10-year journey to get to where we are now. We're only just building the pilot facility, and we did explore sort of trying to put a footprint in different regions. And in the end, we kind of settled on St Helens, because partly St Helens is a glass town. It's got a sort of really rich heritage in glass manufacturing, but also because the kind of the town council and the Liverpool City region saw an opportunity to collaborate with the glass industry to both help the glass industry develop, but also then use that as a way of catalysing renewal within St Helens itself. So sort of right at the heart of the development of Glass Futures it's not just been sort of the government pushing it, or even just the industry and the government working together, but the St Helens Council and the Liverpool City region have been kind of integral in terms of shaping how we've been set up and what our remit is. So for example, at the moment, actually St Helens Town Council, as part of their funding under the Town Deal funding scheme from the government, they've actually contributed some money for Glass Futures to employ someone to actually do that schools piece that we've just been talking about, to actually go into schools with a load of virtual reality headsets that gives kind of like a 3D mock-up of a glass plant and allows them to practice playing around on making bottles with a glass forming machine. So I think there's certainly industry has a real role to play in terms of kind of helping address some of the decline that we've seen in terms of creating those jobs. And I think also then it's not just the kind of core manufacturing, I think, that has an opportunity to grow. But I think once we get sort of, as that manufacturing grows and tries to become more sustainable, hopefully that will also kind of catalyse sort of new opportunities, new companies, new spin outs, or it'll sort of attract that kind of international investment as well. So I think to answer the question, there is a big opportunity for industry to kind of really help address some of that decline. I think we can kind of turn the tide on that and reverse it and start to see manufacturing growth if we adopt the right approaches. And I think actually the kind of sustainability and the economic piece that we've talked about has been sort of a challenge and potentially a barrier. I think actually if we kind of address those challenges in the right way, I think actually we've got an opportunity here to really reinvigorate these kind of communities that maybe have been neglected sort of over the last kind of few decades.
Brilliant. Eoin.
I think actually for me the only way we can really address this, or at least de-risk the fact that communities are being, well, traditionally a lot of heavy industry have been the cornerstone of communities all over the UK, particularly in Wales and obviously northeast as well, and up around St Helens. I think to really reinvigorate and rejuvenate those areas, we need to be looking at what's there and not looking at it with the mindset of what it used to be and what we did. We were a steel producer, we were a coal miner, we were this. It's actually looking at the whole system. What can we do with the resources we have? What can we do that can be adapted and utilized, and how can we interlink all these different elements? Because I think that's what's, again, going back to being sustainable is, if you ever listen to Michael Brangard or Bill McDonough, who developed the Cradle to Cradle certification, the Cradle to Cradle concept, Michael Brangard always talks about being sustainable. If you said your marriage was sustainable, it wouldn't necessarily be a positive thing, would it? But yet we use sustainability as being the ultimate positivity, the ultimate kind of element of prosperity. I think we need to be a lot more than that, and you can only do that, or only be kind of build your ambition, if you start looking at things as a systems level. If you look at it as we manufacture this and that's all we do, because ultimately industry doesn't just manufacture a particular product. There's a whole lot of different streams, byproduct streams, kind of interactions, inputs, outputs, rather than just the product you sell. There's lots of other different things. If we look at the systems around those, then you will see a lot more opportunities. I think what's really destroying communities is assumptions of the past, the legacy knowledge of, well, that's the way we've always done it, so we can't do anything different. I think those sort of assumptions are what can pull communities out of any sort of depth that they're in and issue that they're in. I think that's where we need to start kind of looking at these different approaches and developing new ways forward.
Thank you. Emily.
I think there's a big move towards trying to put sort of monetary value on social impact. So the whole social value question is coming down to us. You know, our customers all report on their social value. Public sector want to ask about social value, or want to know about social value. And I think for me there is a place for it, but I also think, as Eoin says, there's a danger of making assumptions about communities, and so therefore making decisions based on a social value metric that gives you a single point of data or a couple of points of data. And actually I think that can be quite damaging. And I think there needs to be a kind of a hybrid approach that says, do you really understand the communities that you work in, and their needs, or the communities that you influence, and how do you then make decisions or draw that information into your business and make informed decisions? So I think there's a huge challenge ahead around this monetization of social value, because it only gives one picture. And I think stories and connections between people, and connections that go beyond your business, are much more powerful than just the reach of your business and how you measure that social impact. I mean, we're working in Rotherham with one of our house building customers, and Well North Enterprise, looking at how, if you're building homes to the Future Home Standard, which is coming in 2025, how can you extend the impact of that to add social value. So to take the people who are in that community with you on a journey so that they are also benefiting from a move to a greener built environment. So there's some sort of, I think, some moves going on to really try to understand the full reach of business into social impact and to try and address that. But I think the sort of social value frameworks, which have a place, absolutely, we're looking at that ourselves. I think we have to also take with you the real people and the stories and what communities actually are made up of and need. So I'm not sure if that's an answer, but no, that's what I've got.
Thanks, Emily. I'll go to you, Geoff, first, and then I'll come back to you, Eoin, if that's okay.
Thanks. I'd like to talk about rose-coloured spectacles. And this is a pun intended, because I think the question of history and Eoin's point is very, very valid. And I would also then move into the conversation about risking and de-risking different parts of society. For anyone who's been lucky enough to fly into bits of East Africa, within 10 minutes, 10 miles of various airports, you will see huge amounts of flower growing. It's evolved over the last generation, and we ship cut flowers from Africa. The interesting part of that conversation, going back to my rose-coloured spectacles, on one hand, you go, hang on a minute, you don't need cut flowers. Because for a sustainability perspective, that's a whole different conversation. Where we're at now with some of those communities is if we simply took that industry away from them, we would destroy them. Because we have built that based on a premise. And that's also part of the conversation that we're talking about manufacturing and history and societies. I go back to one of the first remarks I made about we have to have strategic intent. We have to understand what we're trying to do and why. Going forward, there's a whole conversation regarding, for example, if you work in systems analysis, if you do what we do now, where are any of us geographically? And the answer is we could be anywhere as long as we have a Wi-Fi connection. And that's part of this dialogue. As we move forward into a world of the Internet of Things and manufacturing, a proportion of those roles can be anywhere. And we need to be aware of that when we're talking about the future of work. Regarding social metrics, I have no answer. I only know we can do more. And every one of our sites in the UK has got a halo that we work on. We have science experiences, we have outreach, we have all sorts of weird, wonderful things depending on the business and what they do. It's better than nothing. It's not bad. I think it's quite good, but I would say that, but we can always do more. But I think the question of planning, strategic evolution, and thinking about things and trying to get people to move away from small pictures into big pictures is an incredibly difficult area. And I'd finish by throwing in the question of borders, because we've just been through a political move over the last few years. We have changed our relationship with all sorts of countries, and that is continuing, both inside the UK and outside the UK. And once you create borders and barriers, you immediately change markets and people make decisions for different reasons. And that's a whole different 3-hour conversation.
Yes.
Yeah, well, what I started with, what I was going to say after Emily, it was now shifted slightly after Geoff. No, I would agree. I think, well, they're kind of related. And this idea of borders and barriers, silos, unfortunately, we continue, and I won't apologize for banging on about the circular economy, because we need to shift towards it, because we're so used to doing things in with our silos and with borders and with barriers that it's very difficult for me to see a future which is anything different than what we already have if we don't break those barriers down. And I include the kind of the elements around the decisions at policy level, the decisions that governments make is based upon situation, is based upon timing, the situation at that moment in time, and things change. And certainly, it's a shame that that coronavirus didn't address or didn't adhere to those borders and barriers that we certainly addressed to. The the element actually that's perhaps we could look to include and address as well is the idea of citizens, and the fact that it's not just about a process or a material or a product, but actually people are the key element in all of these decision making, all of these processes. That if we include the considerations of citizens more widely, and develop the policies based around that, then we might be in a different position. I know there's John Alexander published his book recently on citizens, and it's an interesting read that I encourage people to look at. But also someone like Kate Raworth, who's looking at the donut economics and how whatever we do and however we do it, we deliver within those social and planetary boundaries, and that so at least the planet can recover to a point from the impact we have, but we have a social foundation that it's giving that equality for everyone. So there's a few different areas where we can look to address this, or at least to have some solutions based upon some of the thinking that's already there.
Brilliant. Thanks, Eoin. So again, just conscious of time, I think we've got time for one more question, so I'm going to try and make it a good one. So in a perfect world, kind of 20, 30 years from now, Geoff, you don't look happy. Policymakers have kind of come on board and they've agreed with everything that you're putting to them. The supply chain's got better. What would you, in a perfect world, like to see your company and your sector look like from a sustainability perspective? It's a tough question. There's no right answer, but I think it'll hopefully let our audience know the direction that you want the industry to go. Rob, I'm going to come to you first, because you're the only one who didn't look like you grimaced at the question.
It's easier for me because I'm not actually running a manufacturing plant. Right from the glass industry, we've got a clear idea as to what we think the glass industry could look like in 20, 30 years' time. So we will be running all of the manufacturing assets on sort of green fuels that we've talked about already. We ideally would have a full circular economy approach, so that the glass products that are produced are either reused, and where that's not possible, we get 100% recycled material back into the system, so that we're not having to mine raw materials. I think also we would want the industry to be that enabler to create a more sustainable society. So the glass products, for example, that are produced for glazing, we want to be able to kind of manufacture those and see those implemented into buildings such that we can reduce the environmental impact of the buildings. We want to kind of be making glass that can be used to make more sustainable, sort of more efficient wind turbines, for example. So I think there's that kind of dual element in terms of the manufacturing side, sort of eliminate the environmental impact of the operations, but then also use the products and the material and the expertise to then sort of have an impact sort of down the supply chain as well. And I think also in terms of that sort of people's piece that we've talked about a lot this morning, I think I would like to see that we are bringing lots of people into the industry, and we're in a position where people are actually wanting to join the industry and almost having to turn people away or point them to other sectors because we've got so much demand for the jobs.
Yeah, brilliant. Eoin.
I love these easy questions. They're great. It feels like the final question in the most bizarre beauty pageant ever.
I'm not winning.
I'm not certainly either. Geoff mentioned in I think in his opening gambit was that about the UN sustainability goals. UN Sustainable Development Goals, the 17 of them. And I've commented on this a few times recently, that the UN goals are there because the linear economy has created a need for those goals. And ultimately, they're there to try and quantify the impact of that linear economy, quantify the impact that industry and society have had on the planet for the last, several thousand years. If we had a world which was truly circular, truly integrated, truly systemized, then we wouldn't have a need for those goals, and that's something I'd like to see. And we all, it's not just about what Celsa or one company can do. It's about what society can do and what society can do by coming together as a system solution. I'll leave it at that, because again, there's other things I could talk about in terms of global wars and fighting for land and resources, which we're currently going through now, and all that. But yeah, I think leave it at those goals. I think that's probably good enough. That's good enough for me. If the future looked like that, that'll be fine.
Oh, good. Oh, thanks, Eoin. Emily.
I don't think you can really argue with Owen's point. I think that sort of captures it all. I mean, from a sort of industry or from an Ibstock perspective, I think it's about having, as Rob said, the green energy and completely eliminated our impacts and be contributing positively. So whether that's capturing carbon or other elements within our products so that they become stores, whether it's using our resources from our quarries completely differently for different products that contribute to sort of other benefits in society. I think the core business of firing bricks will be much smaller in the future, and we will have diversified and transformed the way that we build or we develop the built environment. So I think that that would be an extremely exciting place to be, where that sort of overall purpose of the business is being fulfilled, to be making a positive contribution in everything we do, whether that's to people or planet. And I think an inclusive world, I think that would be the sort of ultimate, because then I think from that you will get the solutions, because there will still be challenges in 30 years time, but if you've got an inclusive world, then hopefully solutions will come to those much quicker than they do at the moment.
Brilliant. Thank you. And Geoff?
If you would allow me a brief moment of philosophy, as the person who has lived or tried to live my life as an optimist, and therefore thinks I've still got a fighting chance in the pageant that Eoin and I are in, part of this conversation is that an optimist doesn't have a better life than a pessimist. I just think I do. And therefore, part of the conversation going forward 30 years and talking about what we'd like to happen, I'd like to shy away from things like the next iteration of a pandemic or wars or pestilence. I'd like to talk about an optimistic future, which includes engaged, diverse, and inclusive audiences and stakeholder groups and employees and everything else. I'd like to talk about resource efficiency. I'd like to talk about circularity. I'd like to talk about systemized and decarbonized models. I'd like to talk about effective climate protection. And all of those for me is where I honestly believe BASF can be in the next 30 years. And within that, there are so many pieces to be talked about, planned, managed, and taken forward. And I'll finish by simply saying, I'd also like to think that there's a better understanding of where the foundation industries sit and what we bring to building our societies.
Yep, I think that's a very nice ending point. Thanks, Geoff, and thank you all for taking the time today, this morning. It's been, I'm sure we could have had another 2 hours asking very difficult questions of you all. But no, I want to thank each and every one of you for giving up your time today, and the same goes to the Future Leaders Group members for bringing in those questions, and to UKRI for helping put this together. Yeah, that's it really. Thank you very much for your time, and yeah, please, any questions for anyone, I'm sure we can get them sent in by email and we can pass them to you. But yeah, again, thank you very much for your time this morning.